한국은 그 어떤 나라와도 비교할 수 없는 놀라운 전통과 문화를 가지고 있습니다. 그리고 한국의 역사를 제대로 마주한 외국인들은 그 방대함에 압도당하게 되곤 합니다. 미국 UCLA 한국학 연구소 소장을 은퇴한 존 던컨 명의교수는 한국학의 대부로 불립니다. 그는 1993년 UCLA의 한국학 연구소를 설립했고 UCLA가 해외 최고의 한국학 연구기관이 되도록 앞장서온 사람이기도 합니다. 던컨 교수는 1966년 주한미군으로 문산에 파병되며 한국과의 인연을 시작했습니다. 군인으로 복무하던 내내 한국의 자연과 한국인의 정에 흠뻑 빠져든 그는 고려대에 편입을 원했지만 한국어가 부족한 탓에 거절당하고 미국으로 돌아갔습니다. 미국에서도 한국의 하늘과 한국 가족 문화, 한국인의 따뜻한 정이 그립기만 했다고 합니다. 결국 그는 한국을 공부하기로 결심하고 한국어를 열심히 배웠고 1970년 다시 돌아와 고려대로 편입해 한국학에 집중하기 시작했습니다. 그는 한국을 공부하는데 40년이 걸렸다고 말합니다. 그리고 한국이 얼마나 위대한 전통을 가졌는지 40년을 공부했지만 아직도 한국의 극히 일부밖에 알지 못했다고 말할 만큼 공부하면 할수록 어렵다고 말했습니다. 던컨 교수는 제대로 알지 못해서 한국의 모든 것이 중국에서 시작됐다고 믿는 사람들을 위해 강의합니다. 그가 남들보다 이른 은퇴를 결정한 이유도 유망한 후배 학자들에게 자리를 내주기 위함도 있지만 학교가 아닌 다른 자리에서 강의를 통해 한국이 중국에서 시작됐다고 막연히 믿어온 사람들이 제대로 알게 하도록 하기 위함입니다. 한국인으로서 익숙한 한국 문화가 해외에 전파되는 모습을 바라보는 것과 외국인의 눈으로 연구한 한국 역사를 또 다른 외국인에게 강의하는 것은 조금 다르게 다가오는데요. 한국을 잘 알지 못했던 외국인들에게 충격적으로 다가온 던컨 교수의 강의를 번역해 공유합니다.
We've had in the past 25 or 30 years a great deal of scholarship here in the West, represented by people like Ernst Gellner, Benedict Anderson, and others, that nations, nationalisms, national identities are a modern phenomenon. Came into being at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century in the West. We have a lot of evidence that suggests that at least the elites of pre-modern Korea had a strong sense of what we might call a Korean identity. Of course, these elites also saw themselves as participants in a universal cultural order represented by Confucianism. But at the same time, these Korean elites also said, we are Korean. We can find this evidence in a number of places, particularly in histories. The oldest surviving histories from Korea date back to the 12th century. And these histories are already what we could call national histories. The 12th century is a cordial period. Before the cordial period, there was this period of later Shilla. Before that, there were the three kingdoms. Before that, there's this sort of legendary, mythological old Joseon. But these histories, they trace a genealogy of Korean states. The cordial came from later Shilla. Later Shilla came out of the three kingdoms. The three kingdoms came out of old Joseon. And they adopt terminology for Korea, such as Dongguk, or Eastern Kingdom, in opposition to Chungguk, or Central Kingdom, for China, or terms like Samhan, which could be seen as a kind of ethnic designation, to distinguish themselves. Say, we are Dongguk, we are not Chungguk. We're Korea, we're not China. We belong to this collectivity that transcends individual kingdoms or dynasties, that shares history, language, and a culture. We here in this eastern country, Dongguk, our country, our land, and our people are different from those of China. And there is no reason why we should go out of our way to imitate everything from China. Then we have a 15th century scholar official named Yang Sungji, who I think expressed it very concisely. He wrote, from the very beginning of time, of historical time, in China there have been 27 dynasties. In Korea, or Dongguk, as he put it, there have only been 7 dynasties. Why is this so? It's not simply because of cultural differences between the Chinese and us. It's also because we here in the Eastern Kingdom have these great families who are spread throughout the country and who have blocked treacherous elements. So he's making very clear distinctions between Korea and China in many different ways, cultural differences, historical differences, social differences. And he's clearly expressing the idea that he belongs to a collectivity that is distinctly Korean and has very old historical roots. When I first started studying about East Asia and Korea back long time ago, back in the late 1960s, the textbooks that I read basically said everything in East Asia came from China. Taoism, Confucianism, pottery, painting, the writing system, you name it, it all came from China and spread out from China to China's neighbors like Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. Of course, there was Buddhism, which originally came from India, but it came to China first, and then it spread out from China to the China's neighbors. Okay, sounds good to me, I thought. But then as I began to study Korean history in more detail, I began to become a little bit skeptical of this notion that everything came from China. I'll give you a couple of simple examples. One is the question of the origins of Chan Buddhism. One of the seminal texts of Chan Buddhism, one that was always attributed to Chinese authors, actually was first written in Korea and then taken to China. And this text had in it a number of key concepts for the development of Chan Buddhism, one of which was that the Buddha nature resides in everybody, and thus the Buddha nature is subject to awakening if approached properly. This particular text, the one that is of most importance, is something called Kumgang-sammaegyangnon, or Won-hyo's commentary on the Sutra Adamantine Absorption. So he has concluded that, in fact, it was feedback from Silla that played a very important role in the formation of the Chan school of Buddhism in China. And this sort of turned the existing interpretations upside down. I can give a number of other examples. There's the commentary that I just talked about. One of the things that I can point to is printing. But what I particularly want to talk about here is movable metal type. We've all learned that it was the great Gutenberg in Germany in the mid-15th century who first came up with movable metal type. Well, this notion of movable type apparently made its way to Koryo. The people in Koryo experimented with ceramic type. It didn't work out very well for them for complicated reasons. And so they said, let's do it with metal. And so in 1234, people in Koryo printed the first book in human history that was done with movable metal type. It was a book called the Sangjang Kogum Yemun. What I have up here for you is a printing block, printing plate, not block, for the oldest surviving book that was produced using movable metal print, and that was the Chikji, which dates back to the year 1377 in Koryo. So the point here is that, a lot of good stuff came out of China. But not everything came out of China. Even though we all were sort of mesmerized by China's size and its rapidly growing economy, anybody who paid a whole lot of attention to contemporary East Asia will realize that Korea is a very important player. Another issue is the way in which historical narratives are used to construct modern Korean identities. Things like this long history of suffering. We Koreans got to stick together because these bad guys outside are always picking on us. So they talk about this long history of suffering. And they talk about resistance to outside aggression. The idea that Korean history is a story of incessant invasions by foreigners. It's a history of suffering inflicted by outsiders. The Korean term for this is sunane yoksa. Basically, they say Korean history is a long, sad story of constant invasions by foreigners, by outsiders. To be sure, the last 150 years of Korean history have seen a lot of misery inflicted by outsiders. Imperial competition over Korea in the late 19th century, colonization by Japan, division of the country by the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945, Korean War that broke out in 1950, ended up with US and Chinese forces wreaking havoc on much of the peninsula. So the past 150 years, I'd say yes. You can characterize Korean history like that. If you go back to earlier Korean history, it becomes much more problematic. Here we have some 20th century, 21st century depictions of foreigners invading Korea. The one on your left, I think, is a painting valorizing Korean peasants resisting Mongol invaders in the 13th century. And the one on your right is a modern reenactment of Japanese invaders of the late 19th century slaughtering poor innocent Koreans. We get a lot of that. But the real truth is that Korean history is also characterized by very long periods without any invasions from outside. You can go from the second half of the 7th century to the end of the 10th century, a period of a little over 3 centuries, no outside invasions. You can go from the early 11th century through the mid-13th century. We've got over 200 years without invasions. You go to the 15th and 16th centuries, no invasions. And you go the second half of the 17th century through the mid-19th century, no invasions. 200- and 300-year periods when Korea was not invaded from the outside. I would say that's a rather exceptional case in human history. Maybe Japan, surrounded, protected by its waters, but certainly not China. And certainly not countries like Poland, for heaven's sakes, which is here one day, there the next day, and gone the next, thanks to its Russian and German neighbors. Rather, I would say that it was during these long periods of peace that Koreans really began to develop a sophisticated variant of East Asian civilization in the peninsula. They give us our heroes. Ulchimundok is recorded in the histories as having lured invaders from Sui China into an ambush, and of an army of 300,000 Chinese, only 3,000 supposedly escaped alive. And the other one, Yi Sun-shen. I'm sure all of you have heard of the great Admiral Yi Sun-shen. He was a hero, no doubt about it, and there was some memory of him kept alive during the Joseon period. So you have nationalists and politicians and scholars in the 20th century going back to these historical memories, or reconstructing historical memories in order to create what they think would be desirable modern contemporary Korean identity. Study of Korean history. One of the biggest issues, particularly over the last 50 or 60 years, is whether or not Korea was stagnant, historically stagnant, or whether it was progressing. And from the 1960s on in South Korea, the dominant narrative has been something we call the internal development theory, which says that Korea was following the same general path of progressive historical development as England and other Western European countries. A lot of that has to do with just refuting what Japan's colonial masters had said about Korea being a stagnant, unchanging traditional order during the colonial period. But it's also important because in certain ways it connects pre-modern Korea to modern Korea. It creates this continuity for us between pre-modern and modern Korea. It says Korea had been an advanced country in the past. So there's no reason why Korea shouldn't be an advanced country now. And the internal development theory also depicts for us the early formation of a nation in Korea, a nation that has survived to the current day. So we have this great tradition.
여러분의 소중한 의견을 남겨주세요. 바쁘시더라도 구독과 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 지금까지 단골이시였습니다. 시청해주셔서 감사합니다.